Artificial sweeteners. You said you wanted to close off there.
Yeah. So now let's talk. So we very clearly, the research studies show the ones that are controlled well, it does help with weight loss in a lot of these studies. What about cancer, heart disease, and the gut microbiome? Because that's a lot of the questions that are out there. So with cancer, a lot of people think, oh, there's so many studies showing it causes cancer. Well, first of all, again, we're talking about epidemiology. We're talking about cohort studies. So there's a lot of confounding variables. But actually, so we were talking about consensus earlier. It's kind of I'm on their scientific advisory board, and it's like PubMed plus Chat GPT. So you can ask it a question, and it will immediately like crawl all the research literature and give you a consensus of what the research says, right? And so I did this, and you can synthesize it too, where it'll show you what percentage of studies say yes, no, and then possibly, right? So I think I put in, do artificial sweeteners cause cancer? Do you know 80% of the studies say no? But you don't hear about those. And why is that? Because it's much more newsworthy to put out negative news. Because if you hear a study, this thing doesn't cause cancer, ho-hum, right? But what gets shared a lot? Oh man, Aunt Deborah, she drinks Diet Coke. Deb, have you seen this? You know, it's much more shareable. So that negative news tends to get published more, right? And if you look at the human studies, some of the more well-done ones, like I'm thinking of the Nutrisanti cohort out of France, the conclusion was, oh, it increased the risk of cancer. And I looked into it, I think it was aspartame specifically. If something's carcinogenic, typically what we see is a dose response, right? So if you smoke more, you have a higher risk of lung cancer. Did you know that so they compared like no or like low amount of aspartame users to like low moderate and then high moderate? I want to say it was 3 different groups. So I could be butchering this a little bit, but think low, medium, high, right? The medium group had a higher risk of cancer. The high group didn't. It actually, like, not compared to the low group, it was not statistically different, but it dropped from the moderate group. So to me, and again, we're talking about an odds ratio of like 1.15, meaning a 15% relative risk increase. Let me put that in perspective. 15% sounds scary when it comes to cancer, but relative risk means if your absolute risk of developing cancer in, say, the next 10 years is 10%, a relative risk increase of 15% says it goes up to 11.5.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it goes from 10 to 25, right? So it's important to understand the difference. But again, if it's really carcinogenic, we should expect to see kind of a dose response, right? We don't see that. So to me, that's, especially with all the studies that don't find an association, that's more likely to be some kind of data artifact with, who knows, confounding variables, healthy user bias, what have you.
What about the gut then? So
now there are studies showing that some sweeteners do change the gut microflora, the composition of it. Sucralose appears to, aspartame, not so much. I think saccharin also showed a change to the gut microbiome. Now, here's what's interesting. It's hard to know if that is a good, bad, or neutral change in terms of overall health, because I was looking through one of the studies on sucralose, and they were talking about a couple of species or genuses of bacteria that increased. And one of them that increased was actually associated with people who are leaner, have less obesity, and better insulin sensitivity. And also a species that produce more butyrate. And butyrate actually is associated with a whole host. This is a short chain fatty acid produced by the gut microbiome. Butyrate's associated with a whole host of positive health benefits. So I will say it's worth monitoring, because some of these do appear to change the breakdown of the gut microbiota. But there's probably, you could argue just as much that there's a positive effect as you could a negative effect. So what I'll say is, again, if we look back at shoot the alligator closest to the boat, and there are no solutions, only trade-offs. If somebody switches to diet soda, even if it's not the very best thing they could do, maybe water's the very best thing they could do, but if they lose 20 pounds and their HbA1c drops and their insulin sensitivity gets better and their metabolic health gets better, it's probably a worthwhile trade-off.